Harper's Kennel Stella, Missouri is proud to be sponsoring this portion of broadcasting on KNEO. Owned by Judy and Danny Harper, Harper's Kennel of Stella, Missouri specializes in French Bulldogs. For more information, the phone number is 417-628-3083.
Welcome to Crosspoint. An interactive program featuring ministers and leaders of the Christian community addressing the issues that are challenging the church today. Here's your host, Mark Taylor.
In the beginning, God created, but then an enemy arose. Today on Crosspoint, we're going to take a look at the gates of hell and what that means. Helping me to do this is TV hosts, conference speakers, and authors Derek and Sharon Gilbert. And welcome to Crosspoint today. Now, today I've got a couple of guests here with me by phone. We're talking to Derek and Sharon Gilbert, and we're talking about the gates of hell. And this is unlocking some different kinds of things that I guess, Derek, you and Sharon have found in studying about the gates of hell that maybe people aren't really aware of. We know it's mentioned in the Bible that, the Bible says the gates of hell will not prevail against us, but we know what are, I guess that's a good place to start anyway. Maybe, Derek, tell us what are the gates of hell?
Well, it's a specific location in the north of Israel where Jesus took his disciples, and from his hometown, or the base of his ministry operations in Capernaum, which is on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, this is about a 30-mile walk, which back in the day would take 14 hours of walking. You could maybe do it in a single day if you're in good shape, probably a 2-day hike, but he took them specifically to this location called Caesarea Philippi, which is known today as Banyas, or Peneus, according to the Greeks 2,000 years ago, because there's a great big cave there. Caesarea Philippi was a cult center in the time of Jesus. It was dedicated to numerous Roman gods, but prior to that, Canaanite gods, and the cave there was believed to be the literal entrance to the netherworld, according to Josephus, who was a Jewish historian who wrote in the 1st century, just after the death and resurrection of Jesus. He took part in the great Jewish revolt around the year 67 A.D. He wrote that no one had ever been able to lower a plumb line long enough to hit the bottom of this cave. So when Jesus took his disciples to Caesarea Philippi and said, "On this rock I will build my church," he's standing in front of a 9,200-foot mountain, Mount Hermon, which was essentially the Canaanite Mount Olympus. And then he said, "The gates of hell will not prevail against my congregation, my ecclesia." He was standing right in front of this cave, which all of his disciples would have known, oh yeah, that's the gates of hell, the gates of Hades right there. So basically, that is what the gates of hell are. It's a literal, physical place, and Jesus made a special trip to make this point at that specific location, that he was declaring war on the fallen realm, on those entities on the far side of the gates of hell, which people have been trying to make contact with since, before the invention of writing.
Now, you just mentioned, the Canaanite Mount Olympus there. Now, Sharon, in the book here that you guys put together, is not that the same place where the Transfiguration took place?
It is indeed. You're absolutely right. Good one. Yeah, when the Lord climbed a very high mountain right after that, it could only be Mount Hermon, which is a mount that essentially, the name of it probably is based on the Hebrew word that is haram. It means essentially do not touch. This is forbidden. It's like taboo. It's either so holy that you cannot touch it, or so profane that you cannot touch it. And in the case of Hermon, it's probably so profane that you dare not touch it. I'm going to read the headline to you. In a watery Golan cave, Herod's great-grandson entertained in the Roman imperial style. This is talking about Herod's great-grandson having parties in that cave at Banyas.
Wow, I didn't know.
The gates to hell.
Huh.
So it's been an active place, especially for sinfulness, correct?
Absolutely. It's well known to be a place for sin. And, of course, Mount Hermon, where the Watchers came down, is the sin. Our late great friend, Dr. Michael Heiser, said many times it was far more than just what happened in the Garden of Eden that was responsible for all of the terrible things in the world that broke the bond between mankind and the Lord God Almighty. It was also what happened on Mount Hermon. That was a sin event that had to be covered by Christ's death on the cross and resurrection. And that resurrection part is not to be left out. That is the most important part of that. He shed his blood, but if he had not risen again, we would be hopeless. And the fallen realm, seeing the Lord resurrect himself, was essentially the Lord overturning and poking them in the eye with their very own mythology, their very own story, that very mountain would be where they would be resurrected.
Yes, we know, Mark, from a Canaanite text that the Rephaim, which were the spirits of the giants destroyed in the flood, were not only venerated by the Canaanites who neighbored the ancient Israelites, but one of those texts actually describes the Rephaim being summoned to a ritual meal in their honor at the threshing floor of El. Now, El was their creator god, the father of all of the Canaanite gods.
And threshing floor is a type of portal.
And scholars agree that referred to the summit of Mount Hermon. And this particular text, called by scholars KTU, which is German, Canaanite Text Ugaritic, 1.22, describes the Rephaim mounting their chariots and traveling one day and then another, and then arriving at the threshing floor of El, the summit of Mount Hermon, at dawn of the third day, where the blessing of the name of El would revivify or resurrect the Rephaim.
Give them new bodies.
Right, and this text dates to about 1,200 years before the birth of Jesus. So this is a very old belief in the pagan world. Jesus completely reversed it with his ministry, and again, he declared his divinity right there at the base of this mountain, the Transfiguration. At the summit of this mountain, he was declaring war on these demonic spirits right from the beginning of his ministry.
Okay, now, Derek, you mentioned the word portals, and you talk about in the book demonic portals of Mount Hermon and other places. So this is an entryway for the demonic to enter into our lives where we're living right now, into our atmosphere. Is that what that's meaning? I know you talk about it in the book here.
Well, it was believed by the pagans around ancient Israel that was the case. And interestingly, Jesus, rather than just saying, these things are fake news, this is not how the spirit realm works, he didn't do that. Again, he took his disciples on a 14-hour hike to this location to say, okay, here are the gates of hell. I'm establishing my church on this rock, which is this, again, the Canaanite Olympus, to basically tell them, I am the Messiah. I am the one who was promised. What are you going to do about it? So, yeah, we can argue over whether portals are a real thing, but the fact is Jesus did not say these things don't exist. He went specifically to a place that was believed to be a portal to declare his divinity.
I think one of the problems, Mark, is the word portal itself. We have a modern context of what that means.
Yes.
We sometimes picture this swirly thing in the sky. It's sort of like we saw a few years back for the Norway Spy.
Or the Stargate TV
or the
series.
Stargate thing. But it's essentially a way to get into what probably is what we would consider another dimension, to go and commune with the underworld or commune with the Lord's throne. Well, we do that, we believers. We have access to another realm through prayer. We are always in the Lord's presence because we are covered with Christ's blood. But those back in antiquity and those today who don't have Christ as their covering, don't have Christ as their Savior, if they want to commune with, say, a loved one, think about Saul, who wanted to communicate with Samuel. He went to an oath. He went to what in the English is called the Witch of Endor. But it actually is referring to a ritual pit that was very common back in the day. Saul had outlawed them, but they were very common, and they've been discovered by a lot of archaeologists, these pits where you'd walk down in, and it would be a way to talk to the other world, commune with the dead, so to speak. And the Lord specifically says, we are not to do that. Necromancy is a sin. Necromancy is dangerous. In other words, don't open portals. And I think it comes down to our free will choices. If you do that, you are saying to the fallen realm, you're saying to, the demons and the fallen angels, I want to get to know you. And that opens a door, sort of like letting the vampire in. It opens a door to say, yeah, okay, she or he wants to get to know us. Let's go get to know them. Mm-hmm. And that's dangerous.
Portal can be wherever you are if you're giving permission to these spirits to enter in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well said.
And that happened a lot back in the days of Jesus and in that before Jesus. There was a lot of worship where they were inviting that in and opening that gate, if you want to call it, for the demonic to come in and dwell with men.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm afraid it continues to happen today throughout history. Beginning in the 18th century, there was a spiritualism movement that culminated in Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley and many others that were summoning these ancient deities because, well, frankly, most of it began and became even worse when Charles Darwin erased God from the picture. When he said, we just started, there's been an evolution all along, that mankind began as one species and then became another species, and that means that God did not create mankind. Suddenly, we were all removed from, we don't need God anymore. So by the end of the 19th century, the spiritualism movement had just consumed everybody. It was a drawing room activity to have a seance.
So
we still do that today. I think it's really cool.
What I'm thinking, though, is, you talk about here in the book, in the past prologue part of the book, right at the first, you mention a William Gibson, and you talk about, how his description of artificial intelligence can be sobering. Mm-hmm. You talk about that here in the book. Is not AI something like opening a portal? Is that a possibility?
Oh, I think it's an absolute possibility. That's why we opened the book with it. When you think about what artificial intelligence is doing, it's really an electric-based life form, a life form within a computer, a life form within the Internet, a life form that is created and lives and travels on nodes throughout the world. It is as if the king or the spirit or the god of light or electricity or the air could inhabit it. Yes, I think it is a substrate for habitation and for communication.
And really, the human brain is just a bioelectrical thinking device. I mean, the signals in our minds that our thoughts are essentially electrical signals going back and forth. Assuming they work correctly.
The older you get, the less they work.
But an artificial intelligence is simply an artificially created electrical thinking machine. And we know that the human mind can be overwhelmed by an external spiritual force, demon. Why not an artificial electrical thinking machine?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Very, very good. Now, so, Derek, you put out several different books. You guys are pretty busy in this area of ministry. So if somebody was wanting to know more about maybe getting this book, The Gates of Hell, or finding out more about other books you've put together and other things you do, tell people how they would go about doing that and what they would find.
The easiest way is to go to our website, gilberthouse.org, gilberthouse.org. We have an online store there where people can get books and DVDs. The book itself, The Gates of Hell, is available through all major retailers. You can find it at Amazon. It's also available for Kindle e-readers, also as an Audible book. So if people prefer an audiobook version, they can go to audible.com or amazon.com and get it there.
All right, well, folks, stay with us, and we're going to be back with more right after this. This is Mark Taylor. If you miss a broadcast of Crosspoint, you can always go to our website at www.kneo.org and click on the programs page. There you can access the current Crosspoint program as well as the last 4 programs that have been aired. Never miss another Crosspoint program again. Go to www.kneo.org today. Welcome back to Crosspoint. I'm Mark Taylor. I have with me today Derek and Sharon Gilbert, and we're talking about the gates of hell. This is one of the books that they put together with the many other books they have written and the work they do in this area. And in chapter 2 of the book, it's called Before the Flood. And right at the first there, you talk about when did humanity get the idea it was possible to communicate with entities in the netherworld? So is this where it's all started, back before the flood? And is that what actually brought the flood on?
Well, yes, and this was the belief of Jews of the time of Jesus and the disciples. It was also the belief of the early church. When you read the writings of some of the early church theologians, like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and so on, from the 2nd and 3rd centuries A.D., they understood that God had delegated angels, called sons of God in Genesis chapter 6, or B'nai Ha-Elohim in Hebrew, to administer his creation, to basically help the Lord administer humanity, just kind of watch over us. Hence the term watchers, which is a phrase that shows up in Daniel chapter 4. Apparently, it's a type of angel or a class of angelic being. When Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4 is punished for his pride, this punishment was decreed by the watchers. So this term we see show up in the book of 1st Enoch, which is not in the Bible, but it does kind of expand on the very short description we get of these entities in Genesis chapter 6. But the story is this. Jesus, or rather the Lord, and of course, being Trinitarians, the Lord, Jesus, Holy Spirit, all three in one, the Lord, after Eden, sent the Adam and Eve and their children out into the world. Apparently, these angelic beings came down to earth, saw that the daughters of man were fair. This is Genesis chapter 6. And
well, we didn't have any children yet, so he sent Adam and Eve out into the world.
Sent Adam and Eve out into the world, and as they propagated and had children, and began to do what God had commanded, which is to take dominion to the earth, to be fruitful and multiply. Angels saw that the daughters of man, the young women, were attractive, and according to Genesis chapter 6, took wives of any they chose. And this resulted in wickedness. Now, Genesis 6 doesn't really expand on this. The book of 1st Enoch does, and goes into the sin of these watcher class entities and then their children, the Nephilim, the giants who were on the earth in those days and also after. And because of the wickedness that they engendered, not only the violence that they created, but the forbidden knowledge that they taught to humanity, like witchcraft and sorcery and trying to divine the future by telling, the movement of the stars and the planets in the skies. God decided to wipe the slate clean, and I think this is what Noah, I think we're in agreement on this, when Genesis tells us that Noah was perfect in his generations, meaning his bloodline, his genetic code had not been corrupted by commingling it with the seed of these angelic beings who came to earth. And I know that there are problems with some who have difficulty understanding how is it possible that angels, that these sons of God, these lesser Elohim, could create children. To be honest, as far as the science goes, I don't know how that works. But when Jude describes this sin, he describes these entities as those who left their proper dwelling, who kept not their first estate. I know that Jesus says that in the resurrection that we will be like the angels in heaven, neither marrying nor giving in marriage. But these angels weren't in heaven. They were here on earth. And we've got multiple examples throughout the Bible of angels doing physical things, eating, fighting, breaking Peter out of jail, things like that. So this is what brought on the flood. And apparently Noah and his kids, one of the sons perhaps, maybe more than one, after the flood, remembered a day when the gods, small g gods, walked among humanity, and they tried to reestablish contact with them. And this is where we get sites across the world that apparently were created for the worship of these entities and to reestablish contact. As Sharon mentioned in the previous segment, the Hebrew word ov, which means ritual pit, actually derives from a much older word from the Hurrian language. The Hurrians, the Horites of the Bible, were a people who we can trace their movements back to the Ararat Plain, meaning below the mountain where Noah's Ark came to rest. And they emigrated south and west and wound up in the Holy Land. And this practice that they apparently had been performing for thousands of years by the time of Saul and David, of digging this ritual pit to communicate with entities in the abyss, on the other side of the gates of hell, was still being practiced thousands of years later in the time of David and Saul and Solomon. So again, this is a very ancient practice that goes back to prehistoric eras, and megalithic sites like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and others are probably related to this attempt to communicate with and contact these entities.
And possibly trying to bring them back.
Right.
Jailbreak Tartarus.
Yeah. So, again, looking at the book here on page 75, you got one of your chapters there, you're talking about confronting the gates, and you do mention the book of Enoch, as you were talking about there, and you were talking about, when Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" And, of course, what Peter said, we know there in the Bible that he was Christ, the Son of the living God. But all this takes place around Mount Hermon, which is, the place where, again, there was worship of these different gods. Now, when you talk about all these different gods and stuff, this is all behind Satan's work, right? I mean, Satan's the one that's running all of this different gods and all that. That's who we're really dealing with when you're dealing with these different gods.
Satan is one of the kingpins. He's one of the big guys, but he's not the only one. There are others. And after Babel, you'll notice that the Lord sent down angels. He sent down watchers to help mankind once again, just like he had helped Adam by sending watchers, and they ended up going rogue and going native. But the watchers who were sent, probably 70, which actually just in the old world meant all of them. So because the Lord divided the people divided their languages, every language group would have had a helper, an angelic helper. Well, that angelic helper, in every case but one, decided to take worship. The only case that did not decide to take worship is Michael.
Yeah.
He is the angel that guards over Israel. And the others all took worship. Those are the small g gods. And some of those are trying to, take Satan down. I think that we have one that we look at, that we have followed her work.
Her career.
Named Inanna, also called Ishtar, and many other names. She might even be called Columbia in some languages. But she's been trying to take him down. But I think that there's a time coming when the leader of the Watchers will try to take him out, because he's going to get out of the abyss. We see that in the book of Revelation. They get 150 days. They get 5 months to take over the world. And I think there might be a little bit of warfare at that time amongst the spirit realm.
Yeah, civil war among the fallen.
Yeah.
My previous book, Mark, called The Second Coming of Saturn, traced the career, if you will, of the entity who led that rebellion in Genesis chapter 6. He was the leader of the sons of God. In the book of First Enoch, he's named Shemiyaza. But when you compare the stories from the ancient world, the pagan creation myths and their foundation myths of how their gods came to be, there's one entity who, in many of these pantheons, was one who had overthrown the sky god, and in some of the stories castrated the sky god. Most famously is the story of Kronos overthrowing Uranos and castrating him with a sickle. And then in turn, he's overthrown by the storm god, Zeus. Well, that same story appears in Canaan, where El is replaced by the storm god Baal, in Mesopotamia, where the sky god Anu is replaced by Enlil, who in turn is overthrown by a storm god, Marduk. And this story is repeated again and again, even in the Norse pantheon, where Odin is replaced by the storm god Thor. So it's a consistent story, changes from culture to culture, but the pattern is the same. The storm god Baal in Matthew 12, beginning at verse 22, is identified by Jesus as Satan. But the guy that he replaced was sent down to the abyss, to Tartarus, according to Peter in 2 Peter 2, verse 4. God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but thrust them down to hell, is the word in our English Bibles, but in the Greek it's Tartarus, not Hades. This is a special place reserved for these supernatural rebels. So we've got a biblical account that tracks with the pagan myths, but it's the true story. Mm-hmm. So apparently what happened was during the flood, during the 5 months that Noah's Ark was on the water, according to Genesis 7 and 8, which mirrors the 150 days or the 5 months that these entities will get to torment those without the seal of God on their foreheads in Revelation chapter 9. Shemaiah, Azazel, and his colleagues were sent down to the abyss where Peter and Jude say they're in chains in gloomy darkness until the final judgment. Shemaiah, their leader, he's in chains. Satan emerged as the leader of this rebel faction against God after the flood. We don't see him quite in that way in the Old Testament. Satan is only mentioned a couple of places, and both times he's still got access to the throne room of God when he goes to with the other sons of God to confront Yahweh and say, hey, this guy Job that you're so proud of, if you just let me mess with him a little bit, I can show you, he'll curse you. And then in Zechariah chapter 3, where he's accusing the high priest in the time of Zechariah. But by the time we get to Jesus in Matthew 12, where he says, if Beelzebul, Baal the prince, if Satan casts out demons by his own power, how will Satan's kingdom stand? So by the New Testament, Satan now is a king, and he's referred to as the prince of this world and the god of this world. Mm-hmm. So there appears to be some political infighting amongst the fallen realm, and there may be more in Revelation 9.
We had a conversation with, I think it was L.A. Marzulli.
L.A. Marzulli.
He made a really wonderful suggestion. What if, he said, Satan talked Shemaiah and that bunch of angels into doing what they did? And he said, look, I know it's going to make God angry, but if he puts you into prison, I'll get you out. Yeah. What do you think of that?
In other words, Satan conned Shemaiah, Azazel, and the others into committing a sin that would get them locked up and removed as his rivals.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, with people listening to this, they're going to say, where's all these names coming from? How did you come up with these names? How do you get these names? Now, a lot of this goes back into the Greek mythology, some of that too, right? Where they had names and stuff because they had names for all kinds of gods. But these weren't just names they made up out of the air. These were names that they got somewhere. And so you're saying a lot of this is connected even maybe to that?
Well, yeah, and again, the origin of all of it goes back to Mesopotamia, to the Amorites, to the Sumerians, to the Hurrians, who were really the three most influential people group. A lot of scholars had said for years there's a Proto-Indo-European origin. It came from the north, and they've never found any evidence of this. But what you can see are the parallels between the stories of Jupiter and Saturn, Zeus and Kronos, with these older stories of Baal and El, Marduk and Enlil, and so on. So these are fallen angels, and this was the understanding of the early church. These entities are real. They're not imaginary, but they're fallen angels who demanded worship of humans.
Absolutely. And think of it this way. After Babel, every language group had an angel assigned to it. So eventually that angel decided to take worship. Well, at that point, the angel, in order to be super important, would then say, well, you all remember the story of, Kronos and Uranus? You remember that? Well, I'm the one that did that. Mm-hmm. I'm the storm god. So I think all, if not most of those watchers who were sent with the language groups, Derek, don't you think that they claimed, okay, let me tell you the real story. I'm the one who did it.
Right, and the sky god, the one who created all of this stuff, he's far away. He doesn't pay attention to us anymore. I think that's the fake news version of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
And that's how you end up with all these different names, but the same story repeated. You
right.
get the flood story, then you get this, they came in and helped us story, and then you get these pantheons.
Mm-hmm. And what Sharon is talking about with the angels being delegated to these different groups, this comes from Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. We're not making this up. Mm-hmm. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, and this was a reference to the Babel incident, he fixed the borders of the peoples, or he numbered the peoples, according to the number of the sons of God. And again, that's that phrase that means angelic beings. So apparently, after Babel, God was telling the people of the world, okay, look, you don't want to deal with me, you want to reestablish contact with the old gods, I'll give you small g gods, small e Elohim, to oversee you, but you're not going to like it. Kind of the way when the Israelites demanded a king, and he said to Samuel, okay, go anoint Saul, I'll give them a king, but they're not going to like it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Well, folks, stay with us. When we come back, we're going to be talking about painting that's on the inside of the U.S. Capitol that really, I think, maybe brings back some of these things that you're talking about as a prophecy of what's going on or is going to happen here on this earth very soon, I believe. So, folks, stay with us, and we're going to be back right after this.
Offering words to encourage, teaching to inspire, and truth that defines real life.
This is who we are, what we offer, and what you can expect.
91.7 The Word.
Welcome back, and here we are on Crosspoint today, and thank you for tuning in with us as I have with me today Derek and Sharon Gilbert. Now, Sharon, tell people again how they can find out more about this book, The Gates of Hell we're talking about, but a lot of the other stuff you've done as well.
Absolutely. If you would just go to our website, it's gilberthouse.org, gilberthouse.org. We've got all the information there. We've got articles that you can read. We've got a store that you can go to. But all of our books are also available through Skywatch TV. We're also at Amazon, in most bookstores. We have Kindle versions. We have audio versions. We have the regular paperbacks you can buy. So we're all over the place.
All right. Now, when we just went out of that last segment, you talk about in here about a painting that's on the inside of the U.S. Capitol. You say it contains a disturbing secret about the destiny of the USA and the prophecy of the new golden age triggered by return of, and talk to us about that.
Oh, my goodness, yes. You know, that painting, I don't know if you've ever been to Washington, Mark, but if you've never been to Washington, listeners, you need to go. Go to Washington, D.C. Just take a weekend and go. It's a fascinating place anyway. But go inside the Capitol. Go into the rotunda, and if you're my age, you remember the rotunda being on television because we watched JFK lying in state there. Well, that's part of the reason he was lying in state there, and Derek will get into that in a second. But when you look up, you'll see underneath the dome this really beautiful painting. It's called The Apotheosis of Washington. Apotheosis means becoming a god. So it shows Washington being accepted, what looks like into heaven. And then you start looking at the faces and you realize, hold on a minute. These are Greek and Roman gods. Why is he being greeted by them? And then you start to see other things in it. And just when we were writing this book, Derek and I noticed something else that was really disturbing that shows the destiny of America.
Yeah, Sharon was the one who gets credit for spotting this. She wrote about this
for Tom Horn's
book, Zeitgeist 2025. The listeners should know that the United States Capitol is modeled on the Pantheon in Rome. The dome of the Capitol was inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, which is the building that was dedicated to all of the gods of Rome.
So this is a temple.
Yeah, it is a temple. And in fact, after January 6th of 2021, multiple political pundits, but especially our elected representatives, referred to it as the Temple of Democracy. Our Temple of Democracy was desecrated, and so on. In the Pantheon in Rome, which we had the chance to visit back in 2018, there is literally an opening to the sky, which is called the oculus. That just means eye. That was supposed to represent the portal, there we are back to portals again, through which Caesar Augustus was to ascend to become one of the gods. Now, Caesar Augustus, Octavian, was a smart politician, and he knew there was an anti-imperial sentiment among the people of Rome. So he said, no, we're not doing that. But you can go ahead and apotheosize my Uncle Julius. So Julius Caesar, he had a statue placed in there, and that oculus represented Julius ascending to become one of the gods. That's the reason for the oculus inside the United States Capitol. Now, it's not open to the sky, but the painting makes it appear as though George Washington, has ascended, and he is depicted there with his legs wrapped in purple, which is the symbol of color, royalty, in ancient Rome. So he's depicted now as royalty sitting amongst the gods, and there are a couple of things to note. First of all, the fact that his legs are wrapped. This was how the god Saturn, who I argued in the book The Second Coming of Saturn, was just the Roman name for Shemaiah, the leader of the Sons of God rebellion in Genesis chapter 6, the ones who came down, commingled with women, created the giant Nephilim, corrupted humanity, and so on. Saturn had been locked up in Tartarus, just like Shemaiah, according to Peter, but there was a poem by a Latin poet, a Roman poet named Virgil, who wrote just after the death of Julius Caesar that there would be a coming golden age where returns old Saturn's reign with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. And it goes on from there to prophesy the coming of a child who would see gods commingling with men once again, and a new golden age. Mm-hmm. Well, there was now I'm going to rabbit trail, but anyway, the bottom line is there are those who've been trying to make this golden age a reality ever since then, and the way Washington is depicted with his legs wrapped, again, was the way the statue of Saturn was depicted in his temple in Rome. The only time that the leg wrappings came off, the wool that was around the statue of Saturn came off, the idol of Saturn, was during the Saturnalia, which was the most popular annual festival in the Roman religious calendar.
So the winter solstice. The
winter solstice, around just ahead of the winter solstice, yeah. Now, the other thing that's very disturbing about this is that there are a number of scenes around Washington on the oculus of the Capitol, the apotheosis of Washington. One of them is a scene depicted called agriculture, where a figure called Young America is depicted there with the grain goddess Ceres, and he's wearing a Phrygian cap. Sharon realized when she was writing her chapter for Zeitgeist 2025 that this is exactly the way a minor character in Greek mythology called Ganymede was depicted. Ganymede, if you remember your Greek mythology, was considered so beautiful a youth by Zeus. And again, remember, Zeus is Satan, according to Jesus.
A young boy.
Young boy was carried off by Zeus in the form of an eagle to Mount Olympus to become his cupbearer. Well, it's more than that. He actually became his young male lover. And this is how young America is depicted inside the United States Capitol, inside the dome, the same as Ganymede, who was the submissive young male partner to Zeus, who again Jesus identified as Satan.
As Satan, yes.
Yeah, and the reason, and here's the thing that ties this all together, the reason, Mark, the United States Capitol is called the Capitol, C-A-P-I-T-O-L, is not because that's what you call a building where the legislature meets. When it was built in 1798, there was only one other building on Earth where a legislative body met inside a building called the Capitol, and that was Williamsburg, Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's home state. He's the one who insisted we called our building where Congress met the Capitol instead of the Congress House, which is what the architect wanted to call it. It's called the Capitol because that's the name of the temple of Jupiter, the Roman form of Zeus, was called in Rome, the Capitolium. So Thomas Jefferson insisted we name the United States Capitol, the building where our legislature meets, for the temple of Jupiter / Zeus / Satan, and then inside the dome of the Capitol, through the oculus, representing George Washington, the father of our country, as a symbol of Saturn returning to his rightful place in the heavens. The United States, as part of this new golden age, now depicted as the submissive partner of Satan.
And another thing to remember, Mark, is that, again, if you've been to Washington, D.C., you've seen it. If you go to the Smithsonian, which is just a collection of a lot of museums, a lot of buildings, you see a number of representations of George Washington. And he is represented in several of those in a very Zeus or Jupiter-like pose. In fact, there's one statue of George Washington that is identical to a statue of Jupiter. And it may well be the very statue of Jupiter that was put up, that type that was put up in the temple in Jerusalem by Antiochus Epiphanes. So the idea of George Washington as Satan, that's very disturbing.
It'd be very disturbing, it is. And, you know, this book, folks, has got quite a bit in it. There's a lot here. You've got some drawings in here as well, and just many things we just can't talk about. But I want to hit here towards the end when you talk about the rise of the cyber gods. Okay, tell us what you would consider to be a cyber god.
Well, I think we're starting to see a movement towards that already, Mark, this idea of merging with the machine. Ray Kurzweil wants to do that. He's been doing this for a long time. He is a brilliant man who's worked with Google and many other big corporations. He is a genius when it comes to programming and creating new ideas. And he has been the proponent for taking all of our memories and putting them into a machine, into a computer, into an artificial intelligence algorithm that would be a duplicate of us. And then that would be the new us. So when we were gone, we could be still alive. We would just be inside of a computer. But how about if we take that, we put it into a robot, and that robot could be us, because Kurzweil believes that our memories essentially are our souls, that there's not an actual God-given created soul, that is simply a collection of thought. We are what we remember. We are what we have said and done. So he wants to recreate that in silica, in a computer, and eventually that will merge with organic matter.
Yeah. The transhumanist movement, Mark, is they claim about trying to overcome the limits of our biology, to defeat death through science.
They want eternal life without Jesus.
They want eternal life, but they want it without Jesus. And while they're at it, they wanted to give us superpowers as well. So this is the idea behind the phrase rise of the cyber gods. They want to be able to transcend the limits of human biology. They want to eliminate death. But the problem with this is that when you eliminate death, but you do not eliminate sin, you've basically created the conditions for hell on earth, because then there are no consequences for bad choices. You can do anything to anyone, and you don't have to pay a penalty for it because they think that you'll never die. So this is something that needs to be addressed by Christians. We need to pay attention to this. It's easy to just say, well, they're never going to defeat sin and death. No, they may never defeat sin or may never defeat death through science. But if they convince people that they can, so that they're placing their faith in science rather than in the Creator, well, you know, the enemy doesn't care what we believe as long as it's not the one thing that is true, which Jesus said is that He is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one gets to the Father except through Him. We can believe anything else. They really don't care. But if it's not, as long as it's not that one thing.
Yeah. Just before we go out here, Derek and Sharon, how did you get involved in writing and studying about this? Because this, you know, not everybody is there where you're at. And so what prompted you to want to write these things and to try to open people's eyes to these areas?
I think, first of all, we're both very curious and we love history, but we met a wonderful man named Tom Horn who brought us into his ministry, and then we met, got to know a gentleman that we'd known even before we met Tom Horn in person. That is Michael Heiser. And those two men, Mike Heiser and Tom Horn, they put us on the track to digging into and what archaeologists have found, what linguists have found, what the graphologists have found, all of these ancient texts that many of them have only been discovered in the last 50, 60 years, some even more recently than that. And they're still being brought out of the ground. The rocks are crying out, and Derek and I want to hear what they have to say and convey it the best we can to everybody else.
The bottom line is that these entities that the Bible calls giants, gods, and dragons are real. The prophets knew it, the apostles knew it, the early church knew it, we're not trying to invent some crazy new way to understand the Bible. We're trying to get back to understanding the words of Jesus the way the apostles in the early church understood them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, folks, again, The Gates of Hell, that's the title of the book we've been talking about today. Why don't you folks tell us about, just before we go up there again, how do they get a hold of this book or something that you've already written, or find out more about your ministry?
Well, you can find out more about what we do at our website, gilberthouse.org, gilberthouse.org. We produce 4 to 5 hours of content each week, video and audio. Got a weekly Bible study there that we go through the Bible verse by verse and try to exegete the Scriptures on a verse-by-verse basis. The book is available at our online store. If you want a signed copy, we sign all the books that we send out. But you can also get it through Amazon.com. And again, if you prefer an audiobook or an e-book, it's available as a Kindle from Amazon.com, as an audiobook from Audible.com or Amazon.com. Again, to keep track of what we're doing, gilberthouse.org, that's the best site to go.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much for being with us today on Crosspoint.
Thank you for having us. It was our pleasure.
Our honor. Thank you, Mark.
Well, folks, very interesting today here on Crosspoint as we were discussing, just where the Bible is. Folks, some of this stuff sometimes hard to understand. Some people want to dive in a little bit deeper and find out what is all of these words and who are these players that they're talking about when they mention watchers and stuff. So it does help open their eyes a little bit to where Greek mythology and other stuff has come from and these different gods. So appreciate people when they want to get involved a little bit more to understand these things and help us to understand them as well. But it all comes from the Bible, the book I hold in my other hand. It's the Word of God. This is where all this information comes from. There's no other place. The Bible's the only place that you're going to find the inspired words of God. And they're not outdated, no matter when they were written. They're still as good as they were for then as they are for today and will be forever. The Bible contains the most important words you're ever going to read and certainly ever follow. Be sure to join us again next time as we again discuss issues that are affecting the church. Have a great week and allow God to use you for His purposes so that greater things can be done. Make your life count and God's plans for eternity. I'm Mark Taylor.
Crosspoint is a program produced in Studio 101 at KNEO Radio. Not all of the views on Crosspoint reflect those of the management or staff of KNEO. You may contact the Crosspoint program at 10827 Highway 86 East, Neosho, Missouri 64850, or by email crosspoint@kneo.org. You can hear Crosspoint 4 times a week, Saturday morning at 1, Saturday afternoon at 2, Saturday evening at 9, and Sunday evening at 7. You can also listen anytime online at kneo.org.